Ladies and gentlemen and honoured guests, wherever you might be today, good afternoon, good evening, and in the case of Elaine, I think good morning, but above all, welcome. My name is Bruce Hemmingson, and I will be your moderator for today's presentation and lecture. Along with my wife, Gentana, we are privileged to be among the very few Thailand representatives of the Asian patrons of the arts in the Vatican Museum, known as APAVM. Today's presentation will be recorded for future distribution to you all, so there is no need to take notes unless, of course, you would like to. What I would encourage is that you take a few notes to perhaps have some questions later in the presentation. Today's presentation forms part of the Beauty Ever Ancient, Ever New program, with today's first presentation of what is a three-part series brought to you by the APAVM, where we are grateful for the tireless support, dedication and enthusiasm of our chairman, Mr. Ben Chang, and his wife, Kim. So in advance, let me express our appreciation for both Ben and Kim and our hardworking team for making this wonderful lecture series possible for us all. In today's first lecture, entitled Florence, Medici Bankers to Medici Popes, we will be embarking upon a thought-provoking journey and exploration into the fascinating connection between this Renaissance city, Florence, the Vatican, and the Pope. At its height during the Renaissance period, Florence was a center of enormous wealth and influence. Florence had risen as a republican city-state funded by trade and banking, where its often political, bloody scene was dominated by rich mercantile families, where the most famous of these were the Medici. From humble beginnings, the Medici became bankers to the rich and powerful families in Europe and bankers to the Pope. Their most enduring legacy was their significant and enduring patronage of the arts, for which the world owes the Medici family an eternal debt of gratitude. Artists that included Brunelleschi, Donatello, Fra Angelico, Botticelli, and Michelangelo all thrived under Medici patronage support. Today, we are fortunate to join with art historian Elaine Ruffolo as she charts the Medici family influence on the political, economic, and cultural history of the beautiful city we have come to know as Florence. Our journey will take us from the early 1430s with the rise of the Medici dynasty under the legendary Cosimo de' Medici to the golden era under Lorenzo il Magnifico to the family's ultimate goal of a papal tiara. So, without further delay, allow me to welcome and introduce our most esteemed and highly knowledgeable art historian and guest presenter, Elaine Ruffolo. So let me talk a little bit about Elaine. When Elaine Ruffolo was an undergraduate studying Baroque art in Rome for 2 weeks, she took a train to Florence for a visit. She had such a wonderful sense of belonging in Florence that she considered not returning to her home in Wisconsin to complete her studies, but she did. Mind you, I wouldn't have blamed her because the Wisconsin winters are brutal at the best of times. It took Elaine a few years, but eventually she did return to what she refers to as her rich and varied life living in Florence. Elaine has now been teaching Renaissance art history in Florence for over 30 years and is extremely popular amongst her students and adults alike. Elaine holds degrees from the University of Wisconsin and Syracuse University, and first came to Italy on a full-time basis as a Florence Fellow back in 1989. Elaine has since lectured in Italy for many American university programs that include Syracuse, Stanford, and Vanderbilt universities. Currently, Elaine has developed a series of academic travel programs for small visiting groups such as the Smithsonian Associates, Yale Alumni, College of William and Mary, the Clark at Williams College, and patrons of the Vatican. He is on the advisory board of the Friends of Florence and consults for CEO and YPO programs across Europe to include Rome, Florence, Sicily, and Naples. Now, without further delay, please now welcome Elaine Ruffolo to the microphone. So, Elaine, it's now your show.
Thank you so much. I'll share my screen immediately So you can look at some wonderful images, and we'll get started on this fabulous journey through the Medici, who began as bankers, and of course, for our subject matter, will end up as popes. And a big thank you to Ben and Kim for inviting me to do this presentation. And thank you, Bruce, for that really lovely introduction. And again, at the height of its power, Florence was the center of enormous wealth and power and influence. And Florence was a Republican city-state funded by trade and banking, and its often bloody political scene was dominated by rich and powerful merchants. And the most important of them all will, of course, be the Medici. Now, here is Florence in the 15th century. The powerful city of Florence that will eventually give birth to the Medici family. But let's take a look first, before we jump into the Medici popes, at how all of this came to be. Let's take a look at the rise of the House of Medici. We're going to look at how they made money and how they transformed Florence into what we call the cradle of the Renaissance, and all the violent and interesting episodes along the way. And again, the world owes the Medici family a debt of gratitude, because it's under the Medici that these great artists such as Brunelleschi, Leonardo, Verrocchio, Andrea Pollaiuolo, Michelangelo, Filippo Lippi, Botticelli are going to be patronized by this great family. And the word for that in Italian is mecenatismo, which means patronage of the arts. It's more than just paying for things. It's taking care of the artists, giving them influence, connecting them to other patrons. Mecenatismo, a little bit like patrons of the Vatican, I like to say. Now, certainly, Florence at this period, they were able to transform this great place into the cradle of the Renaissance. But the very, very beginnings of the Medici are all wrapped up in legend. And it circles around the Medici coat of arms, which are these balls. It's wrapped up in, the story goes like this. Alvardo di Medici was a brave knight who was doing battle with a monster to save some poor villagers in the countryside. His shield was dented in several places from the blows of the dragon. Alvardo took those dents on his coat of arms as red balls on a field of gold. That's what you're looking at now. The red representing the blood of the dragon, and the gold, of course, the wealth of the Medici. And ever since then, balls have been known in Italian as palle, P-A-L-L-E, means Medici. This is the insignia of the Medici. Another explanation for the source of balls could also be that the Medici originally belonged to the Apothecaries Guild. Their name, Medici, is associated with medical apothecaries. From the very beginning, the Medici liked to link themselves as healers to the Republic of Florence. And here I just popped up an image of the Palazzo della Signoria, the seat of the government. It's all probably much more prosaic than heroes and dragons and apothecaries. Probably the balls represent coins, like the pawnbroker's balls. So any of these things will give us the source of the insignia of the family, which will be placed on the things that the Medici will pay for. The supporters of the Medici, when they would pass by their palace, would chant palle, palle, which means balls, balls, which is slightly disconcerting if you think about it. So despite their claim to this historic, glorious past, the Medici's beginnings were probably pretty pedestrian and irredeemingly bourgeois. They moved to Florence during the 12th century as economic migrants from an area north of Florence called the Mugello. And I just put an image of the Mugello up on your screen. It's an area high in the inhospitable Apennine Mountains. If you're looking here on your lower right-hand side on this picture, it's right here, running right down the center of the Italian peninsula are the Apennines, creating a spine and dividing up Italy east and west. And the Medici come from the very beginnings of those hills just north of Florence. And it is an area that's known very much for its monasteries, castles, feudal fortresses, all high up in the Mugello. But really, the truth is that the Medici were just one family amongst the many thousands of country dwellers who were streaming into Florence during the late 13th century. They were trying to make a living. It was the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the rise of city-states, I guess not unlike the immigration to the United States at the turn of the 20th century. In fact, the very first document ever even mentioning a Medici was a certain Bongiunti di Medici, who was given seat on the city council in the year 1216. I bring that up because the fact that someone had a last name in 1216 tells us that the Medici were already of some standing if you were to have a last name. We also know that they were in the money lending business because there exists a document from 1240 that a certain Chiarissimo Medici was loaning money to a monastery in Florence. And those are the very, very first mentions of the Medici from the Medici archives. But let's go back to why did they come to Florence in the first place? What's so attractive about the city of Florence? Well, by the opening of the 13th century, Florence was enjoying an unprecedented period of wealth and prosperity. The city was incredibly wealthy based on a thriving textile industry and the profits made by merchants dealing in luxury goods. Here's a little smattering of what you could have found in Florence. Look at those beautiful textiles. This painting here where my cursor is was done by Domenico Ghirlandaio, showing us the beautiful high quality textiles. Here are two weavers in the lower right-hand side. Here's a swath of silk in the left-hand side. And here on the upper left-hand side are the wool dyers. They would take these enormous pieces of wool that came from as far away as Scotland, dip them into boiling horse urine, and dye it into beautiful fabrics that created very high-class textiles that were sold off to the powerful courts of Northern Europe, even sent off to the Middle East. And that industry provided the wealth and the infrastructure for many other small businesses in Florence. First comes textiles, and then pretty soon, Florence is going to be filled with furriers and farriers and silk merchants and apothecaries and judges and notaries and bankers and shoemakers, and everybody's making money in Florence. The Florentines were very, very good at making money, and the city will soon, because of that wealth, will become a banking center. Okay, so first comes textiles. Then comes the guilds of the furriers, farriers, apothecaries, etc., and then will become the city's bankers. Wealthy city, sure of themselves. And what were the names of the very top bankers, let's say in 1300? The Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Albizzi, the Acciaioli, the Alberti, the Mozzi, the Frescobaldi. Now, I don't expect you to have heard of any of these, except if you're a wine fan, you probably have heard of the Frescobaldi, but you'll notice that the Medici's names are not up there in these early days, because the Medici were probably a bunch of thugs coming in from the Mugello. These are the old guard, the kind of nobility that are running the banking industry in the early days. So keep that in mind. Then also keep in mind that Italy was a hotbed of innovation and invention, thanks to travel and tourism in the form of pilgrimage and also in the form of crusaders, especially thanks to a Venetian named Marco Polo. He will bring in, and the crusaders will bring in new ideas from the East. Of course, China, Persia, these areas, India had already gone through their Renaissance. How does the West get these ideas? Thanks to the travelers and thanks to the crusaders. and they would bring in new ideas to Europe, such as double entry bookkeeping, the use of Arabic numerals, writing things down on a brand new technology called paper, a clock divided into 24 hours, spectacles. Keep in mind that Florentine males had a 70% literacy rate, which is astounding. The children in Florence in the 14th century were taught arithmetic, not jousting and falconry, but things that are practical. And much of this knowledge comes, of course, from the East. Something else to keep in mind, that the political system in Florence really favored businesses and merchants. It's a pro-mercantile government. They made a law in 1293 that excluded the nobility from voting. One had to be male, over the age of 27, belong to a guild, that is a labor union, in order to vote or hold public office. They elected the mayor every 2 months. Now, the Medici, remember the people coming down from the Mugello, they were businessmen, and they belonged to the Guild of the Apothecaries initially, then wool merchants, and then later on bankers. So they were always politically active. Now, initially, the Medici settled into the very, very center of Florence. And here's 2 images from the 19th century showing you what is today the Piazza della Repubblica. But at the time of the Medici, it was known as the Old Market, the Mercato Vecchio. And there still is a very small street just off of the Piazza della Repubblica called the Via dei Medici. And it was here that the Medici would exchange money. It was a pretty sketchy area, crowded, full of gamblers, prostitutes, and eventually it was the site of the Jewish ghetto. I always bring this up because it's a rather inauspicious beginning for this great family. Now, this is where you would go to change money. Now, initially, only Jews were allowed to loan money. Matthew wrote, "It is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven." Now, Jews were not allowed to own property. They were not allowed to join guilds, and they were often driven out of society. Hence, they had to deal with movable objects such as jewels or pawnbrokers or money changers. And because of a loophole in the law, the Jews could loan money at interest. Christians could not, neither could Muslims. Jews could not charge interest unless they were loaning the money to a non-Jew. And this is an image, a rather anti-Semitic image, unfortunately, of the Jewish moneylenders. But very soon, the Christians realized that they were missing out on something. And these missing out on the money that could be made from loaning out money. And here you can see the old medieval Christian moneylenders. How do I know there's Christian? Because I can see Jesus Christ up at the top. This is a really interesting image because it shows us the very beginning of banking in Florence, and this is what the Medici were initially doing, behind what's called a banco piccolo, or a small bank. And if you look over here on your lower right-hand side, here I'll get in close for you, you can see that the exchange rate was made from behind a low wooden table. And this wooden table was called a banco, which is where we get our word bank. If these bankers ripped you off, the punishment was to break up their table. And the word for broken table in Italian is banco rotto, which is where we get our word bankrupt, which I think is really interesting. Look, right here at the top is Jesus Christ saying, don't charge too much interest. And in fact, in the spirit of mercantile profit, the Christians realized that they were really missing out on something. And therefore, the Jews were nudged out of the banking business. They always remained pawnbrokers. They were carefully regulated to the amount they could charge for interest, and they had to pay a heavy tax for the privilege. The Christian bankers began to flourish in Florence, and you already know the names, the Alberti, the Acciaioli, the Frescobaldi, the Mozzi, and they began to loan money for interest. And of course, that's called usury. And the definition of usury is the practice of making any money on immoral monetary loans. Thomas Aquinas said it was wrong because you couldn't charge for the thing and the use of the thing at the same time. Think of it like you can't charge for a piece of cake and eating the piece of cake as well. Dante, in fact, will put usurers in the circle of hell that scorch for eternity in burning sand, and they'll wear fat money pouches around their necks with gold florins hanging around their necks. Well, that's not pleasant. So how do we get rid of the sin of usury? Well, they figure out a couple of loopholes, the Christians. In order to prevent investment, the church stipulates that the investor could share in profit only if he shared in part of the risk. Then in the 13th century, there was a stipulation that was made that the lender could charge interest to compensate for profits foregone for the time that they didn't have the money. Then the Medici began to, or the bankers began to hide interest in excess charges of goods. Then you could hide profit in service charges. And finally, you could play with exchange rates. How do you hide the sin of usury? Here's a review. You can charge for risk. You play with the currency exchange. You can charge a late fee, and you overcharge for the selling of goods. And this brings in an interesting topic as well, which is the gold florin, which was first minted in Florence in 1252. And it's hard to exaggerate the importance of this. Only pure 24-karat gold was used. Each coin weighed 3.53 grams, which today would be, one gold florin today would be worth about $150. And the message was that the Florino could be trusted, and certainly the city of Florence could be trusted. And so this is our background that brings in the Medici bankers. Florence was proud and aware of herself, and she knew that she was something special. And that's how we call this il più bello che si può, as beautiful as possible. And this is the time of the very greatest Medici. Here they are, the great Medici, starting on your left-hand side with Giovanni di Medici to your right, Cosimo the Elder down below to your lower right, Lorenzo the Magnificent, and Cosimo de' Medici. They made an extraordinary amount of money, and in turn, they spent lavishly on their city, famously claiming that they earned money for the love of God, for the love of family, and the love of profit. Fantastic. Here is our first Medici of interest. This is Giovanni di Medici. He's not the first Medici, but he's the first that I want to talk about today. He's a self-made man. He began simply as a bank teller in his cousin's bank in Rome. Think of him as a kind of rags to riches individual, sort of J.D. Rockefeller type. He was smart because he married well. He married way above his rank. He married Piccarda Bueri, who I just showed up on your screen. And she came in with a substantial dowry, which Giovanni di Medici, by the way, Giovanni di Medici means Giovanni, son of Bici. Bici is a Florentine slang word for bisticciare, which means to haggle. So John the haggler's son marries Piccarda Bueri way above his rank. And she brought in a big dowry, which he promptly invested in textiles and made a fortune. I always like to bring that up because the money begins with a woman, and at the very end, it will end with a woman as well. He opens up the very first bank in Florence in the year 1397, and it was a perfect moment because this was the moment that the old guard, remember, Bardi, Peruzzi, Mozzi, they were really on their knees. Bardi and Peruzzi banks had gone bankrupt because they loaned money to the English king Henry IV, and the Alberti had been banished from Florence in 1382, and Florence was just getting off of her knees from the bubonic plague. Giovanni di Medici swoops in, and he takes over the banking business with the money that he earned from investing in his wife's dowry. And here you can see one of the things that he did that made him so successful was double entry bookkeeping. That is to put in practice, this was put in practice by Giovanni de Medici. The sheer amount of capital that was flowing through the bank generated by traders during this time needed to be accurately tracked, hence double entry bookkeeping. Assets equal liabilities plus equities. I know I have a lot of business people on this program, so certainly this is familiar to you. Along with this efficient bookkeeping, the Medici also utilized something called letters of credit, which allowed international trade to flourish. The first check in history was written in Florence under the Medici. And this is when a bank agrees to pay back the seller's bank once goods and services have been delivered. And this is important because, traveling was dangerous and impractical to ship large sums. And here, using a check, you could assist in the flow of merchandise. So the success of the formation of the Medici Bank in 1397 cannot be emphasized enough, and this occurs under Giovanni de Medici and his son Cosimo. Here's our glimpse at Cosimo de Medici. They worked together very well. Double entry bookkeeping, the first Medici Bank, letters of credit. But one of the great keys to the Medici's success as bankers was the idea of branch offices. The Medici bankers opened up branches in all of these locations. Isn't that astonishing? And so what this means is, with their branch offices, they were able to get their hands on the papal bank account. This is our first tie to the papacy. And they're going to be bankers to the popes, which means that every good Christian that owes the pope 10% of their income, which we all know is called a tithe, could drop it off at one of the handy dandy Medici drive-up bank windows. And they could collect it in Basel or Lyon or Constantinople. The Medici got to keep that money for 1 year, invest it, loan it out again. Are you ready for this? At 27% interest. And that, my friends, is called usury. But of course, usury can be expiated through those techniques that I showed you earlier. Next, the Medici are going to lend money and secure to both secular as well as religious princes. The Duke of Milan, that you're looking at the upper left-hand side, Pius II, the Eugenius IV. And as I said, the Pope would take that money that came down to the Medici Bank in Rome and cash it for a hefty service charge. So it's really interesting. Then they traded commodities. They invested in cloth manufacturing and alum mines, and hosted the Ecumenical Council, which was a moment that they were trying to bring together the Eastern and the Western Church. So it's really a fascinating tale to how these Medici made money. Why were they so successful? Review. Double entry bookkeeping, currency exchange rates, letters of credit, trust in the gold florin, paper notes, branch offices, good customers, service charges, bank deposits, and solid investments. That's your background to the Medici banks. Now here is Cosimo de' Medici. He's going to be the son of Giovanni de' Medici, and he's known better as Cosimo il Vecchio, because there'll be another Cosimo who comes on the scene in the 16th century. He too marries well. He marries Contessina Bardi, and that last name should be familiar to you because she comes from a family of that old guard banking family, which is interesting because we can assume that he could have taken over her father's business associates. Medici were still considered new men, thugs from the Mugello, and they legitimized themselves as Florentines by marrying into the old guard. These marriage alliances are so important. Cosimo here is looking back at the old nobility of Florence, and the scope of the patronage of Cosimo de' Medici, mecenatismo, was unprecedented. He was the wealthiest citizen in all of Europe. You might think of him like the wealth of Bill Gates or maybe Elon Musk at this time. And he fulfilled his Christian duties and justified his wealth through patronage. As an example of his wealth, he spent 40,000 gold florins just renovating the Church of San Lorenzo. At the time, that would be the equivalent of 6 million US dollars. He's going to patronize artists that we all know and love, many, many projects, working for churches. He would build villas. He would beautify monasteries. Oh, and of course, he is crazy about books. Let me just emphasize this for a moment. He began an impressive library in 1456. And his librarian was someone called Vespiano di Bisticci, who's known as the bookseller of Florence. I'm bringing this up because Ross King, who's going to be your third speaker in a few weeks, wrote a book called The Bookseller of Florence, and it's all about Cosimo's books. Now, besides the many, many projects that Cosimo is going to commission, is his family palace. And I know many of you have been to Florence. We've walked by here together, or some of you on your own. He built it on the property that he inherited from his father. He joined all the properties together and created a new residence that could accommodate his growing family. And here is the Palazzo. It is situated on a very busy street in Florence called the Via Cavour today, but at the time it was called the Via Larga. And it was built by Michelozzo, incorporating 22 pre-existing buildings within it. It's easy to see and it's easy to be seen. It juts out into the main road. And it has a view of all the major buildings in Florence, places that became patronized by the Medici family, such as San Lorenzo or San Marco, the cathedral, the baptistry. And it is a grand home, to say the least. Now look at the exterior for a moment with me, and you can see from the exterior there are some quotations that make it look like a fortress. This is a rather old image, but you can tell from the cars. But here's a long bench, which is a place for people just to sit down and take a load off. It's heavily rusticated. Here's the window. This was the Medici ATM. It was once open, and you could have a quick access to the Medici Bank. Then as we move up, you can see that it gets smoother and smoother, biforial windows, a little bit shorter second level, and a smaller third level, giving us a sense of slenderization. Lots of references to classical antiquity, especially when you look at the roof line, which looks like the top of the Pantheon. But never forget who belonged here, because I can see the balls, always the balls telling us that the Medici paid for this. So always, this was the unofficial town hall of Florence, because this is where Cosimo de' Medici was the de facto ruler. Now step inside with me just for a moment, and you can see the elegant interior. There's a much more refined taste on the interior with grays and whites. Medici balls, balls, balls. And right here in the very center of the courtyard was once Donatello's beautiful bronze David. That's my favorite statue in Florence. Today, of course, it's at the Bargello, but at one time it stood right in the courtyard of the Medici, commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici, who was great friends with Donatello. Donatello's even buried a few feet away from Cosimo de' Medici. And then what this does, everyone, is it really gives a kind of character to the city, because other families, such as the Gondi, the Strozzi, the Antenori, the Pazzi, the Quaresi, these are the new men in Florence, they are going to build palaces that are reminiscent, certainly, of the Medici. You know, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Now, let's continue. Piero, this is Cosimo's son. He's known as Piero the Gouty. There's his date. He doesn't last too long because the poor fellow suffered so much from gout, which was a family ailment, and spent most of his time in bed. He too married well. He married Lucrezia Tornabuoni, one of the real stars of the women of the Renaissance. Not many women shine in Renaissance Florence, but she certainly did. And she came from an excellent family of the Tornabuoni. Her brother was the business manager for the Medici Bank in Rome. So we still have the Medici marrying into local kind of nobility. Now, certainly his greatest contribution to the arts was inside the Medici Palace. There I showed you another image of him. Inside the Medici Palace is this beautiful interior, which he commissions in 1459 by a little known artist named Benozzo Gozzoli. And this is the one that was on the cover of the advertisement for this presentation. Isn't that sumptuous? Piero the Gouty has a taste for the ornate. I love this image. It's the beginning of the cavalcade of the Magi. What do the three Magi do? The three Magi bring gifts to the Christ child. And of course, the Medici want to be thought of as gift givers. Remember, they're worried about their damned souls. So they're going to commission these works of art, and they like to be associated with Magi. Look, here's the first of the Magi. Way at the top is a castle that is an imitation of one of the Medici's villas in the countryside up in the Mugello. And then look at the lower left side of the painting. Here's a close-up. We can see that it's filled with Medici portraits. Here we can see Cosimo the old man. I'll get in close for you. By Benozzo Gozzoli. He's there looking out at us. Look, he's riding a donkey. He's riding a donkey because he doesn't want to instill jealousy amongst his peers. Who else rides a donkey coming into a city? Christ, for goodness sakes. Then here we can see Piero the Gouty on the left. He paid for the room. Here's one of the first people of color painted in the Renaissance. Here we have the Duke of Milan, the Duke of Rimini. Here's a young Lorenzo the Magnificent with his little brother Giuliano. Here's Pope Pius II, looking a little bit irritated because he's stuck in the back row. Everyone, these are the movers and shakers of Florence. It's like a giant Medici Facebook page. So now I'm moving along. We're seeing these important works of art paid for by the Medici. Now, Piero the Gouty dies young. He dies in 1469, and Lorenzo takes over the family business. These dates up here, friends, 1469 to 1492, are the dates that Lorenzo ruled the family. He was 21 years old when he took over. And Lorenzo is one of the most remarkable characters in the Renaissance. He was a truly gifted individual. He had exquisite taste, great humanity. I want you to think of him as a kind of Republican prince. And Lorenzo was absolutely recognized by the people of Florence as the unofficial prince of the city. He was loved and respected by most Florentines. And he gave himself a title, Lorenzo il Magnifico, which is terrific. Now, again, Lorenzo was born way ahead of the game because he had a big silver spoon in his mouth, kind of like a John F. Kennedy type. And like JFK, he ushered in this golden period of Florence that could be considered like Camelot. Because of his father's illness, Lorenzo had already been well trained, and he took on a lot of responsibility, and he was under the tutelage of his father, Cosimo. He was really one of the brightest lights of the 15th century. Now, he too married well. He married Clarice Orsini, who's from Roman nobility. Now we have an example of the Medici turning away from the Florentine nobility and looking down towards Rome, because they got their eye on the ultimate prize, the papacy. Clarice Orsini, a Roman girl, comes in and she marries Lorenzo. It was not a very happy marriage, but under that, we get ties to Rome. Lorenzo was the de facto ruler of Florence, and again, one of the most respected men in all of Europe. He was an enthusiastic patron of the arts. He spoke Greek and Latin. His little brother, here's his little brother, named Giuliano. He was the handsome one, the golden boy, a little bit like Bobby Kennedy compared to the Kennedys. And it's under these two, certainly Medici, that Florence is going to flourish. And he makes these It's not that Lorenzo the Magnificent actually paid for so many works of art, but he helped artists find patrons. Mecenatismo, patronage, Andrea del Verrocchio, Ghirlandaio, Botticelli, all thrived under this period. So it was a golden age of Florence under Lorenzo and Giuliano. It was a great time to be alive, but trouble was brewing in Rome in 1474. There was a pope named Sixtus IV. He was a nepotist, and he wanted a kingdom for himself and his nephew Riario. He needed money. He asked Lorenzo, who you see on the right, and Lorenzo denied loaning him money because he was afraid that his power-hungry nephew would try to gobble up Florence. The Pope was so angry, he took the bank account away from the Medici and gave it to the Pazzi family instead. They wanted to get rid of the Medici, and the plot was hatched that on April 26, 1478, there was a conspiracy, murder in the cathedral. That Easter Sunday, Lorenzo the Magnificent and his little brother Giuliano, here's Giuliano on the left, Lorenzo on the right. Giuliano had a bad cold that morning, so they had to roust him from the Medici palace, and he was rushed out the door to attend mass, didn't feel well, and forgot his chainmail. Lorenzo the Magnificent took his place as the first amongst men in front of the altar, and the signal for the conspirators to jump out was the moment that the host was being lifted, and that's when the Pazzi family conspirators, including the Baroncelli, jumped out of the audience and began to stab Lorenzo. They got Giuliano at the front door. He dies in a bloody heap at the front door of Florence Cathedral, and Lorenzo managed to keep his wits about him, and he took right in front of the altar of Florence Cathedral, he wrapped his cloak around his forearm and fended off the blows. He managed to get here, where my cursor is, inside the sacristy and get the doors shut, waiting to see which way the crowd would go, for the Medici or against. He had the doors shut with his trusty friends, and he could hear the chant from outside, palle, 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 which means balls, balls, balls. And that's how he knew that the Florentines had gone on the side of the Medici. He came out, they've rounded up all the conspirators, and they were hanged from right outside of Town Hall. And this is an image, a drawing done by Leonardo da Vinci, 1478, the Pazzi conspiracy. The drawing is rather chilling. Leonardo wrote in his typical hand from right to left, one dead man, purple cloak, red socks, black tongue. Chilling. It's called the Pazzi conspiracy, murder in the cathedral. Giuliano dies. You can see him being killed here, and Lorenzo goes on to become more powerful than ever. And this ushers in certainly the sadness that he lost his little brother. Lorenzo became more and more of a recluse, more and more studying Neoplatonic philosophy, and that's when these great works of art come in, painted by Sandro Botticelli. This is where the Birth of Venus comes in. Already interesting because you can all see that that is not the Virgin Mary. Instead, we have this interest in mythology. Okay, so Lorenzo's studying this. He's studying Neoplatonic philosophy. Remember, also, Constantinople had fallen to the Turks in 1453. Where did the intelligentsia come? They came to Florence, and with them they brought new ideas, books certainly, or the Ecumenical Council of the mid-15th century brought in new ideas. What does Renaissance mean? Rebirth of the principles of the Renaissance. It's not that they thought that gods and goddesses were running around, but this idea of the contemplation of beauty can move your eye closer and therefore your soul closer to God. All right, let's read this beautiful, beautiful work of art, which is today at the Uffizi, I have wind gods on the left side, blowing Venus to the edge of the island of Cyprus. Over on the right-hand side is the goddess Flora, who comes bouncing over to cover up Venus's nudity. Venus's body should be vaguely familiar to you. It's based on a statue called the Venus de Milo, which is found today at the Louvre, but the Medici had a copy of this. Everything about this painting is about beauty and love and the idea of your soul uniting with God. Here's another one by Botticelli, equally as beautiful. This one is called Primavera, Allegory of Spring. The image of Venus in the center, she's pregnant, it's new life. Here is Mercury on the left-hand side, taking his Caduceus, just poking at this bucolic scene. Here I can see the three graces, which are all the same woman shown in three different positions. And the wind god, Zephyr, who grabs this tree nymph who metamorphosizes into Chloris, the goddess of the flowers. Now listen, that's not easy. Not everybody gets that iconography. But remember, these paintings were painted for the Medici, therefore could be complicated and challenging. It suits the patrons. So after the death of Lorenzo's little brother Giuliano, we go through this period of real golden age of Florence. I would say the golden age of Florence would be right here, 1478 to 1492. And here's Lorenzo surrounded by translators and artists and painters. This is supposed to be the young Michelangelo coming in to present him a statue. 1492. As an American, this is an important date because 1492 is a watershed year. 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. What else happens in 1492? The New World is discovered. The Jews are expelled from Spain. Spanish Inquisition. The Muslims are kicked out of Spain. That Italian named Christopher Columbus is going to make the first voyage and discover the New World. And guess who's not on the boat? The Italians. Yes, I know Christopher Columbus is Italian. So is Giovanni Verrazzano. So is Marco Polo. But who's paying for this? You know, the Spanish. And so it's the Italians are getting fat and lazy. It's the beginning of the end of the importance of the Italians. And look, Vasco da Gama is going to make his way around the Cape of Good Hope. The New World is found, and in 1494, the Peace of Lodi, this peace that was brokered by Cosimo de' Medici, is going to fall when the French king marches into Italy. 1492, Lorenzo the Magnificent dies. And 1492, his son, better known as Piero the Unfortunate, takes over the family business. And the Medici will get kicked out of the city because he brokered a deal with the French. Who takes over the city of Florence? This guy, Girolamo Savonarola. Now, if you've not heard of Savonarola, I know you've all heard of something called the Bonfire of the Vanities, where people were expected to throw anything sinful into the bonfire of the vanities, including books, tapestries, musical instruments, playing cards. Savonarola called Florence Sin City, and of course he criticized the Medici and these merchants until he goes too far. He calls the Pope the Antichrist. So now we have Pope Alexander VI. He's a Borgia Pope who excommunicates Savonarola. He's brought to justice here. This is the Palazzo della Signoria. He's found guilty of heresy, hanged and burned in the Piazza della Signoria, right here. Now, bringing this up because Michelangelo is around at this time. He is 23 years old, and he will be hired to carve the David. Now, I'm not going to talk about the David because our topic is about the Medici bankers and popes, but I will, in these last 5 minutes, bring us to the period now to remind you that now the Medici have been kicked out of the city in 1494. Where do they go? They go to Rome. Of course they do, because that's where Clarice Orsini, remember the wife of Lorenzo the Magnificent, her family is. They go to Rome, they have protection, and in the year 1512, excuse me, Lorenzo the Magnificent's second son, Giovanni, is elected to the papacy. Wow. Now we have power on a grand scale, on an international scale. The Medici have the ultimate prize, the papacy. This is, again, Giovanni. He'd be the little brother of Piero the Unfortunate, elected to the papacy. He takes on the name Leo X. And he said, God gave us the papacy, let's enjoy it. He had a glittering court. You can tell, look at how sumptuous this painting is. He's looking over at his cousin. This is the illegitimate son of Lorenzo the Magnificent's brother, the one that was killed in the Pazzi conspiracy. This is Cardinal Rossi. He would be the brother of Lorenzo the Magnificent's daughter, aunt. And so it's all about nepotism, giving people offices. Next, he's got to fill his coffers, so he does so through simony, the selling of offices. Then he comes up with the idea of indulgences. Indulgences meaning give the Pope enough money and he can take time off of purgatory for you. And it makes the Medici Pope Leo X fabulously wealthy. He dies pretty young, probably of fever from being out hunting in the cold, or at least that's what it's called. And the next Pope is a Pope from, he's a Reformed Pope from Flanders, who doesn't last very long. Then comes Clement VII, and he's Pope from 1523 to 1534. Two Medici. Remember, this is Giulio de' Medici, the illegitimate son of the brother of Lorenzo the Magnificent. So now I got two Medici on the papal throne, almost one after another. And this is a great period of turbulence. Who recognizes the fellow on the left side of my slide? Martin Luther. 1517, he's going to pound up 95 theses at Wittenberg Cathedral, and we begin the Protestant Reformation. What does Protestant mean? Protest. Who are they protesting? The Medici. Who recognizes the fellow on the right-hand side? That's, of course, Henry VIII. He wants a divorce. And the Medici Pope won't give him one because he's siding with the Spanish. So he breaks off of the Roman Catholic Church and begins the Church of England. Under what Pope? The Medici. And finally, in 1527, under Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, Rome is going to be completely sacked under those mercenary troops of Charles V. And that happens under what Pope? The Medici. And so what we find is this incredible period of time from Florence at the opening of the 14th century, all the way to this golden age under the Medici, to the age of discovery, to the high Renaissance, these turbulent times, to the end of the Renaissance, and the end of the line of the Medici from bankers to popes. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Got my exactly 50 minutes in. Thank you for that timing. And I'll be very happy to answer questions.
Okay, so Elaine, thank you for what has been an amazing and thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure we've all learned a great deal more about the Medici bankers to the Medici popes. I know that we have a number of questions from our audience regarding your talk, so I would like to open the floor for the next 15 minutes or so, if you wouldn't mind taking a few questions.
Sure.
I have, just to get things started, and in fact, I created the first question. Are there any remnants of the Medici family remaining today in Florence or anywhere else for that matter?
Right. It's a good question. No, the Medici are all gone. What happens, maybe I'll have to come back next semester and talk about the second half of the Medici. So the Medici will continue on all the way until the year 1743. And that's when the last Medici dies. Her name was Maria Luisa de' Medici. Her husband died of syphilis. She didn't have any children. This is when the Medici become dukes. So you have to think of the Medici as starting as bankers to popes and then dukes to the end, which is 1743. She didn't have any children, and she's the one who gave it all back to the city of Florence. Now, I realize that seems almost impossible, especially because there were so many Medici. There is probably, if you do DNA somewhere, someone's got some Medici blood. But because the Medici male line was rift with syphilis, they don't continue on. So technically, there's no Medici left. It all belongs to the city of Florence, and that's all thanks to a woman, which is pretty interesting. Girl power.
Well, sad they disappeared, I guess, having been so prominent, which leads me to the next question. How central were the Medici family to the growth and expansion of Florence in the 1400s? So did they just profit from it, or did they actually help the city grow in terms of...
Yeah, I would say that both. They profited and they helped the city grow. But you had to be on the side of the Medici. They could be ruthless and bankrupt you or exile you. They did this to the Strozzi family. Of course, the Pazzi family never came back after the terrible Pazzi conspiracy. But, under Lorenzo the Magnificent, he was such a great diplomat that they extended their power beyond. Florence was really woefully prepared for any kind of warfare. She had no standing army. She just had a small militia. So they had to protect themselves through diplomacy. And that's something that Lorenzo the Magnificent did so beautifully. So their power comes through diplomacy and money, and they would use their artists as diplomats, if you will. So, for example, Lorenzo the Magnificent sent Leonardo da Vinci to work for the court of Milan for Lodovico il Moro and solidified those lines between the two. Or Medici women would marry into important houses of the northern courts. So absolutely it went on. They profited and helped most of Europe.
Okay, I think in part you've answered the next question. Did the Medici banking dominance extend beyond Florence and Italy and into Europe?
So I see that.
Yeah.
Okay, so it did, but just for a short period. I don't want to emphasize too much the power of the Medici as bankers. It was a short period of time, I would say from 1397 to 1492. They were dominant. Under Lorenzo the Magnificent, they actually lost quite a bit of money and they closed a lot of Medici banks. He was much more interested in patronage than running the banking system. And you'll see other bankers come into the realm, the Rothschilds, for example, or the Fuggers, I'm sure you've heard of, and the Medici will go declining in terms of, but they had already had their eye on the prize, which was the papacy.
Okay, because I saw, I think in one of your slides, they had a branch office in Constantinople,
I know, isn't that crazy?
Which is the modern day Istanbul. So clearly they ventured into Turkey. And I think being Catholic, you kind of wonder how that worked out.
Well, at the time, would not have been under the control of the Muslims. Remember, the Muslims don't get it until, the Turks don't get it until 1453. So before, it's a Christian city, absolutely.
Right. Okay. So also in line with this, were the Medici family amongst the first to build the practice of modern banking as we know it worldwide? And who other than the Medici were involved or with the rollout of modern day banking as we know it?
Right. They were definitely amongst the first to build the practice of banking worldwide, as we just said, in Constantinople. Who were the other bankers or inventors of banking? For sure, it would have been the Muslims and probably some form of banking in the East. So much of what we've learned in Europe had already been covered in the East, which is appropriate for this audience. I like to give them the most credit. Probably India was the first place where they were doing the invention of modern banking. Then through the Jews, of course, and then the Christians develop it so they can make the profit.
Okay.
It's from Ruby. Good question.
Yeah, those last two questions were from Ruby. And I have one from Francis Tan. How did two Medici get to become a pope? Seems almost too easy. Is there a process for papal election? Did you have to pay for it?
Yeah.
And could you elaborate what actually happened?
Yeah, that's a good question. You did pay for it, but it's a little bit like, running for president. You were going to get your people behind you. And Leo X, so what happened was Lorenzo the Magnificent already had the eye on trying to get his son made first a cardinal. And he does that by paying the Pope, and the Pope at the time was Julius II. Giuliano della Rovere, the great high Renaissance Pope. So Giovanni first is made a cardinal, which means he's got to move to Rome. He was only 17 years old. He wasn't even a priest, which is incredible. So he's made a cardinal. That means that he gets the money from a cardinalship because it's the tithe. You're getting money as a cardinal, and you sit on the College of Cardinals. And then you try to solicit favor because who votes for the Pope? The College of Cardinals. And he was elected when Julius II died. Julius II liked Giovanni de' Medici, probably backed him up as his successor. Surely there were people against it because the Borgias, for example, hated the Rovere, but he won the election. Then he's going to continue through payments. I mean, it's quite political, much more than religious, to back up who he wants to be the next pope, which would have been his cousin. First thing he does is he legitimizes his cousin, which you can do if you're the pope. Then he puts his other cousin and little brother in to run the city of Florence, and also gives him a title, because popes can give titles as well. He made him the Duke of Urbino. So we're raising up now the Medici from simple bankers to titles. Then after that reform Pope, Adriano the Seventh, I think his name was, Giulio de' Medici is elected to the papacy. And that was not an easy time for Giulio because Leo had spent so much money. He found that the coffers were almost empty, and he didn't really know what he was doing, and he wasn't what his uncle was, a very good diplomat. And so he's going to get smashed by Charles V. Then, if you want me to continue, Charles V, what he does with Charles V is he marries his illegitimate son, who was half Moorish, half Pope, to the illegitimate daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Medici become dukes. So it's really a web of interesting power and patronage.
Okay, I think in part, the next question from Madge Laguerre, I think her name is, you've already partially answered it. So what important factor and strategy played a crucial role in the Medici family ascent to power? Is it their inherent business acumen, or their being able to marry well, or I'd actually add to her question, or their total ruthlessness?
That's a great question. One thing to keep in mind is they also had some luck, because when the Medici came in to Florence, those major banking families, Bardi, Peruzzi, Albizzi, they were really down on their luck because of bankruptcy. And also, Florence was just recovering from a period of the bubonic plague. And I realized that you'd think the plague, of course, it was a terrible loss of life, but it actually did quite a bit of good for the economy of Florence, because there was more money in fewer hands, and there was a concentration of wealth in the businessmen, and there was cheap labor coming in from the countryside. The end of feudalism was caused because of the bubonic plague, And the bankrupt families left this vacuum that Giovanni di Medici could fill. So that was a little luck. Timing was just right. Then, of course, I think it was because of their shrewdness and invention, and because they were not noble. So they were shrewd, smart businessmen who didn't mind rolling up their sleeves and learning a new trade. So I think that those were factors that, and they did marry well. Of course, as I tried to show with every Medici, I highlighted who did they marry and how that was advantageous to them. I could do a nice talk on just Medici women.
Okay. We might invite you back for that. So one final question from Eric Yo. What are the palaces and noble homes that were built by the Medici family that still remain in Florence to this day?
So there are two in Florence. Well, actually, technically three. The first one I showed you, which was eventually sold to a family called the Riccardi family in the 17th century. But it's still known as the Palazzo Medici-Riccardi, and that's the one I showed you. Then the Medici moved into the Palazzo della Signoria. I also showed you, that's town hall. And it's called the Palazzo della Signoria. And then the Medici move in, and it's called the Palazzo Ducale because the Medici were dukes. Then Eleanor da Toledo thought that was too drafty. So she bought with her dowry, the Palazzo Pitti. Therefore, the Palazzo Pitti was the dwelling of the Medici dukes. That's three. And then outside of Florence, innumerable villas, at least 50 of them, villas that started under Cosimo, actually started all the way under Giovanni di Medici, all the way to the Medici dukes.
Okay, so with that, let me put a line under today's presentation. So, ladies and gentlemen, and especially Elaine, thank you for attending and participating in today's lecture. And if we've not been able to answer questions that might have come to mind, we do apologize, but we will attempt to correspond with you directly if you require additional feedback. Now, before we depart, now is perhaps a suitable time to mention the various trips that have been organised for the APAVM members dating back to 2016, where unique travel and gastronomy adventures have delighted those that could attend. Typically, each of these visits takes in a province of Italy, which is then augmented with a visit to the Vatican, while also touring many of Rome's historic landmarks. Last year, 2022, we had an unforgettable visit to the island of Malta in the heart of the Mediterranean Sea. In September of next year, 2024, once again, the APAVM is heading off on a new adventure that will cover Naples, Rome, and of course, again, seeing us welcome back to the Vatican. Now, being part of APAVM was not something that was on our personal radar screen until one day I received a call from Ben Chang asking if my wife Gentana and I, and there's Gentana pictured in these photographs, would like to come along on an upcoming 2018 trip to Sicily, Rome, and the Vatican. As you might say, the rest is history, as we were so enthralled by the experience of art, history, amazing food and wine, and an ever-welcoming team at the Vatican. We went on then to attend in 2022 and then 2023 as the world started to emerge from the COVID pandemic. So just very quickly, and not wishing to bore you, we'll go through just a few of the slides. I think probably notable in the Sicily, Rome, and Vatican, this first slide, you can see us all assembled in the Sistine Palace at the Vatican, or Sistine Chapel, should I say. It looks like a palace. And then our group photo together. Normally, if you go through this place, there are people who are queued up forever and you're not allowed to take photos, but this is our small group. And of course, then we get to dine in a small annex to one side of the Sistine Chapel. Really an amazing experience. Okay. And there's Gentinara and I. We actually all got taken out to the Pope's private residence just outside Rome. Another amazing experience. Further photos of us at the Sistine Chapel and having dinner with our friends at the Vatican. Really quite amazing. Here we are in part at on the slopes of Mount Etna on a wine pairing and food event. Again, really quite amazing. The mist came down on that day. It's a little bit overcast, but really an incredible experience. Then we were invited out to the private home, palace of a noble lady, I think a princess, I can't recall her name, where we came along for dinner. She opened up the home. I'd hasten to add that many of these places that we visit are just not open to the general public. You don't get there. And then, of course, it was on to Tuscany, Rome, and the Vatican. Here's a group photo to the left of my screen at Anima Mundi, which is something that was of personal interest to the Pope, and where the patrons, Asian patrons, contributed significantly to the rollout of this. And I think the Anima Mundi is still an ongoing project. 2022, still Tuscany, Rome, and the Vatican. Here we are back in the Sistine Chapel. Again, a small group. I see Gentinara and I, along with Kim Chang, pictured there. And personal choir, private choir, who performed inside the Sistine Chapel for us. Really an amazing moment. Here we are. Can't actually recall the name of the palace we were in, but it housed one of the world's oldest organs, or the oldest organ that was played for us. We had a very famous musician come along and entertain us. Again, these are things that just do not happen to the regular tourist visiting these locations. And then Malta. Going to Malta, here we all are. Malta was a place I'd only ever read about and had always wanted to go there, didn't think it would ever happen. And really, what an amazing place. This was a real highlight, incredible time. From Malta, we traveled back to Rome, had the opportunity of being in St. Peter's Square with the Pope doing his usual roundabout. Unfortunately, at this time, the Pope was now more confined to a wheelchair, but as you can see, an anxious crowd out in front of him. And if we go to the next slide, you can see, here we are. A few of us, including me, had the privilege of actually greeting the Pope at very close distance, so really quite an honor. And here we are again. This was in Malta, as I recall, and the opportunity of really enjoying some of the sights, some amazing food as well. Really quite memorable. Also in Malta, I think most memorable for my wife, Gentinara, was a visit to the Hypogeum. They only let small numbers of people into this area. It was an ancient crypt or catacombs with over 7,000, they estimate 7,000 people buried there at one stage, who have now mostly diminished to dust. Importantly, the Asian patrons are now taking applications and registration for the 2024 visit to Naples, Rome, and the Vatican, with this trip promising to be one of the best yet. Naples, of course, offers us amazing museums, Roman art, nearby Mount Vesuvius, and of course the city of Pompeii. And that's before mentioning the wonderful Neapolitan cuisine that we would enjoy. The Vatican is one of the world's largest museums, so having our APAVM members come along to this, and with there's always with each visit something new to delight and to see. I've heard people say we've seen the Vatican. The Vatican is so large, I don't think you ever fully see the Vatican. These tours are carefully curated by Ben so as to maximize every moment of the journey. And I recently commented that for the price, it would be impossible to have any single tour company put together such a value-added packaged adventure. I'd also hasten to add, places are limited to 30 patrons, so don't delay making your reservation now, as you would indeed be very, very sorry to miss out on this. If you've enjoyed this first lecture and have not already joined APAVM, why not take a moment to go and click the QR code on your screen and take the time to join this amazing organization. Now more than ever, the APAVM needs your involvement and direct financial support to keep our many previously planned activities moving forward. You may not know that the majority of any membership fee is directed towards the various restoration and art preservation projects that we support at the Vatican Museum. Preserving this part of our world heritage can also be part of your own personal ongoing legacy. And I take great pride in the fact that we've been able to do that. Do please join us next Tuesday, 12th December, at the same time for the second lecture in this fascinating three-part series, where we will have Mr. Fabrizio Nivola join us to present on the captivating topic of Renaissance Siena, Art for a City. Fabrizio promises to be a most engaging speaker, so do mark this lecture event in your calendar, and if possible, also invite your friends and family along to join us on the day. So finally, support and contribution. Thank you again for attending today's lecture, and we've had an amazing attendance throughout. These lectures are proudly brought to you by the Asian patrons and their many friends and contributors. While the lectures are offered as free to everyone, a small contribution on your part would be appreciated to ensure the ongoing viability of these top-class productions. If you'd like to help, then let me once again allow you to click the QR code on the slide in front of you, and please take a moment to donate to these most worthy presentations that we get to participate in. Okay, so we've come to the end of today, and until we hopefully see you all again next Tuesday, 12th of September, at the same time, may the good Lord watch over you all and keep you safe. And thank you very much.